so much for coming out this evening. My name's Colson. I'm the head of debating here at the Glasgow University Union, and it's my pleasure to be joined by Ross Greer for tonight's conversation event. Ross Greer is the Scottish Greens co-leader and MSP for the West of Scotland and party spokesperson for finance and education. When Ross was first elected in 2016, he was the youngest MSP, and Ross previously served as a member for the Scottish Youth Parliament and worked for Yes Scotland in the run-up to the 2014 referendum. He currently sits on the Finance and Public Administration Committee, as well as the Education, Children and Young People Committee in Parliament. So thank you so much for Ross for being here this evening. And the way this evening is going to work is I've prepared a couple of questions here on my laptop to go through just to kind of get the conversation started. But you guys are more than welcome to use the QR codes posted around the room to use the Slido. So when you enter a question there, it'll appear right here on my laptop. So hopefully we can get this a bit more engaging. Just to start us off with some maybe lighter conversation, you were one of the youngest MSPs when you were first elected. What moment or moments in your youth inspired you to become so politically active?
It's a good question. Thank you all for coming out. When I first joined the Greens and when I started speaking on behalf of the Greens, I sometimes spoke to a room that, the phrase 2 men and a dog, sometimes the 2 men weren't even there. So it's nice that there's a relatively full room for this. I joined the Scottish Greens when I was 15 in 2009, so at that point there were more students at my high school than there were members of our party. So I didn't join the party with the expectation that I would become an MSP, much less become its leader. And when I first got elected in 2016, I was 21, there were a lot of journalists who were asking, like, what was that one moment where you suddenly realised that you wanted to get into politics? And I think I probably disappointed them a bit because there wasn't any one singular moment, there wasn't any kind of tipping point. I knew as I kind of became a teenager, my politics started to form. I knew that I was a socialist. I knew that the climate crisis was the greatest crisis that we face as a species. And what really attracted me to green politics was the holistic nature of it, so recognising that the environmental, the economic and the social crises that we face are typically caused by the same things, and therefore you need a holistic solution to that. And it took me a good few years before I realised what had kind of formed the values that I had that led me to the party. And the kind of quippy joke version of it that I tell people is, Sunday school made me a Marxist, Jesus made me a Marxist. And it was realising that it was my faith, which I still have. I'm a member of the Church of Scotland. It was my faith and the kind of values that instilled in me that shaped my politics and led to me joining the Greens. It just took a good few years after that before I realised that's what it was. And particularly, my party uses this strapline a lot about for people and planet. And to me, I can, on a personal level, take that back to the 2 most important instructions that we're given as Christians, is to love God and love our neighbour. And to me, I don't think you can do that without loving and protecting creation. So on a personal level, it was my faith that led me to my politics. But in kind of practical application of that, it was thinking I could just continue shouting at the TV, I could continue haranguing other politicians on Twitter, or I could go out and do something about this. And don't worry, I'm not going to spend the rest of the night quoting Bible verses at you, because it's probably not what most people came here expecting. But the one that I keep coming back to is when Jesus is delivering the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, not blessed are those who believe in peace, or blessed are those who talk about peace, blessed are the peacemakers." And the kind of rough translation of that is more not the way that we would use the word peace in English, more about the Jewish concept of shalom, which is the presence of justice in the world. So I, from a really young age, was brought up in an environment where I was told that we are compelled, we are drawn to build a more just world. And without realising it, that's what led me into green politics. And it kind of escalated pretty quickly. This is not what I expected to be doing by the time I got to 31.
Thank you. Just building on that kind of last bit, we were talking about the difference between like being a peacemaker or embodying peace. I think one of your controversial opinions is maybe on your stance on NATO. So if you could articulate a little bit more on why you have the particular stance on NATO that you do, and why do you believe an independent Scotland should not be a NATO member?
Yeah, so as Colson said, the Scottish Greens position is that we would be opposed to an independent Scotland joining NATO, not because we are opposed to security and defence cooperation. and certainly not because we had any sympathy with Russia. I have been sanctioned by Putin. I'm one of about 250 people in the UK who are on the Kremlin's sanctions list. I can't say I was planning any holidays to Moscow or Vladivostok that that's particularly got in the way of, but it was a fun novelty because of the work that I'd done with Ukraine. There's really two simple reasons. One is, on a point of core principle for us, NATO as a first strike nuclear alliance crosses a moral red line. So NATO reserves the right, declares that it has the right to launch the first strike in a nuclear war. So not a retaliatory strike, but to launch the first strike, what it believes, what it would say is preemptively. If you launch the first strike in a nuclear war, you are the party responsible for the end of the world as we know. There is no small-scale nuclear conflict involving NATO. We're talking about a world-ending conflict. I don't think any organisation, any group of people on Earth have the right to do that. So Greens have always opposed nuclear weapons. One of the movements that kind of coalesced in the 70s to form the world's first Green parties was the movement against nuclear weapons. So on the basis that NATO is a first strike nuclear alliance, the Greens are opposed to it on a moral level. I try to use the word evil pretty sparingly. I think it's overused in politics sometimes. I do genuinely believe nuclear weapons to be a moral evil. The second reason that we would oppose NATO is because it's not an alliance in defence of freedom and democracy. So NATO would argue that that's what it is. It was created in the Cold War in the context of Soviet totalitarianism to be this bulwark against that, the free world, the West, versus the Soviet sphere of influence. I really struggle with the idea of NATO as an alliance in defence of freedom and democracy when NATO includes countries like the United States and Turkey. So I do a lot of work with the Kurdish community, particularly Kurds who come from Turkey and from Syria. Turkey is a NATO member, and whilst a NATO member, Turkey has committed a campaign of ethnic cleansing against its own Kurdish population and the Kurdish population in northeast Syria that is equal to the ferocity of what Israel has inflicted on the Palestinians. So I can't square that with what I hear about NATO being an alliance in defence of common or shared values. NATO is a power bloc opposed to another power bloc, but it's not formed on the basis of shared values, shared belief in freedom and democracy. I mean, for a start, Turkey is not really a democracy. It's a very carefully managed democracy to keep Erdogan and his party in power. You only need to look at not just the United States under Trump. Obviously, the United States is going through an extreme form of its right-wing politics at the moment. But for the whole period in which NATO has existed, the United States has interfered with, rigged, overturned democratic elections in the rest of the world if the people that they didn't want to win won, particularly in South America. So those are the two core reasons why the Greens would oppose an independent Scotland joining NATO. We reject the concept of a first strike nuclear alliance because we want to build a world where nuclear weapons don't exist at all, but we do not believe anyone has the right to launch that first strike. And we don't believe it is an alliance in defence of freedom and democracy. We are in favour of cooperation in defence of freedom and democracy. We are strongly in favour of robust action against Russia, in particular right now in the context of Ukraine. But that's not what NATO does. I actually think that what we've seen, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is a huge speeding up of the process around what collective European security and defence looks like, i.e. what does our defence look like when we cannot rely on the United States as a partner? I think that is a good and healthy discussion because I do not believe we can rely on the United States as a defence and security partner. I certainly don't share the values of the current administration in the United States. So if we talk about cooperation for security and defence being on the basis of shared values, I think there's much more progress to be made on that at a European level, but excluding nations like the United States, like Turkey, whose governments certainly do not share the values that I would want to see from a defence alliance that we're part of.
Thank you. So if an independent Scotland were to join the EU, I would reckon they would be within the EU's common security defence policy, kind of building that idea of more common European security without the UN, of NATO. But how would this alliance fundamentally differ from NATO, given that most of the member states of Europe, or the EU, are also NATO members?
Yeah, so given what's happened over the last couple of years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been this massive shift within the debate in Europe about what does the Common Security and Defence Agreement actually look like, and what does it want to be in the future. I was about to say what do we want it to be, but we are not obviously currently part of that discussion, which is a shame. I hope the UK rejoins the EU, I certainly believe an independent Scotland will get there first before the rest of the UK rejoins. The kind of critical differences are, one, a European common defence framework would not be, in the current one, is not based on that first strike nuclear policy. It is not a defence policy based on having weapons capable of wiping out the entire global population. It is also a defence alliance based on the rule of law and democracy. So the European Union is a flawed institution, of course it is, but it is fundamentally an institution based on not just national democracy amongst all of its nation states, but supranational democracy. There is a European Parliament. The European Commission and Council are made up of the democratically elected member states of the Union. We have core minimum standards around freedom and democracy. Those are under strain at the moment, particularly in Hungary, to some extent under the last Polish government as well, but particularly in Hungary. But as a result of that, the European Union is taking action against the Hungarian government because of what they've done to undermine press freedom, because of what they've done to attack the democratic institutions, because of what they've done to attack independent universities. So you can see the European Union, imperfect as it is, demonstrating that it is a club based on a common set of rules, particularly around democracy, but also that has a common legal system subject to the European Court of Justice. I was involved in taking one case to the ECJ, a successful case. So I have seen the European courts in action. I think those are the kind of critical differences. NATO is not fundamentally based on a shared belief in democracy, as I was saying earlier on. The European Union is a peace project, fundamentally. It's not based on nuclear weapons. That's not the kind of common rationale for it. But it is also an institution that has its own legal system, that has courts, that has a shared parliament as well as all of our national parliaments. So you have those democratic safeguards built into it. And for me, if I want to cooperate with other nations to pursue peace and collective security, it has to be based on those common values around the rule of law and democracy. So much as European current common security and defence policies, I would have issues with them. So Frontex, for example, which is the Schengen zone, not the whole of the European Union, but the Schengen zone's border patrol basically is Frontex. I think Frontex are responsible for some pretty horrendous human rights abuses, particularly around the Greek islands. There's massive issues with the deal that the European Union did with Turkey to push back refugees, that some European governments have done, and the cooperation Frontex has with, for example, I'll say the Libyan government, one of the Libyan governments. So it is a flawed institution. It is an institution under huge challenges, but fundamentally it is one based on a common desire for peace. That's why the European Union exists. But there is, imperfect as it is, minimum standards around democracy and the rule of law, and I don't think NATO can say the same.
And do you think there's a realistic path forward for an independent Scotland to rejoin the EU?
I believe so, yeah. I mean, fundamentally, I believe that independence is coming. There's a whole range of reasons for that. Some of them are the pull factors. Those of us who believe in independence, those of us who are involved in the movement, need to do more to persuade people of it. Our colleagues who oppose independence, I think, are often doing a better job of persuading people of why we need it than we are. For a long time, there was essentially a theory that the modern independence movement had reached the heights that we did because of the UK's Conservative government, that Scotland was so overwhelmingly opposed to Conservative governance that that's what was driving the independence movement to the point where we almost won. We've seen over the last year the theory that some of our unionist colleagues had, that if you just changed the UK government to a Labour government, it'd be closer in line with Scotland's values, support for independence would decrease. Support for independence has ticked up ever so slightly. It's certainly not gone down. The polling average at the moment, I think, has independence very narrowly in the lead, but within the margin of error, certainly. So you would call it 50-50. There is a challenge for us there because, and this is core to why I believe we should be an independent nation, ultimately the only way for us to legally achieve our independence is for Westminster to recognise it, is if we have a referendum that has been granted by the UK government. There is a problem there because both of the current major parties in the UK, and if you consider Reform to be a major party as well, all three are opposed to another referendum happening basically under any circumstances. It doesn't matter how many times people in Scotland vote for it. So there's a massive anti-democratic challenge there. Let's say we get to the point of having won that referendum though. I think the reaction across Europe would be one of overwhelming positivity. If you go back to 2014, the independence referendum, we had huge challenges on the yes side anytime a senior European politician was asked to comment, because at best they would stay neutral, but more often than not, pretty senior European politicians, right up to the President of the European Commission, Barroso at that point, but also including a lot of heads of state and ministers in various European governments, were pretty negative about Scottish independence. And a lot of the time it was because they didn't really get it. So the nationalism in most European contexts is a negative political force. Nationalism is generally something associated with the far right. In Scotland, that's obviously not the case. I wouldn't say I'm a nationalist. The Greens are not a nationalist party. We're pro-independence. My colleagues in the SNP are hardly a far-right party. They're centrists, liberals, social democrats, however you want to phrase it. But in 2014, most European politicians, most European governments didn't really understand that, and were generally quite hostile. They weren't the only ones. Barack Obama came out against independence. That was a difficult day in our office because he was the most popular politician in Scotland at that point. Probably still is one of the most popular politicians for people in Scotland. 2016 totally changed that. It really radically changed the attitude of most other European political cultures towards Scottish independence, because the penny just kind of finally dropped for them. I remember speaking to colleagues of mine in the German Green Party before 2016 who said to me, why do you want to balkanise the UK? Because their only familiarity with a nation being broken up was what had happened in the Balkans, the former Yugoslavia, and they were in the German government at that point that had to deploy troops for the first time since the Second World War to prevent what the Serbs were doing at that point. After 2016, we just didn't get comments like that anymore. What we get overwhelmingly is just sympathetic looks from other European politicians, and not just from my political family, not just from the Greens. You would kind of expect that, but the whole mainstream political spectrum in the European Parliament is overwhelmingly sympathetic to Scotland's position now, and we've repeatedly had senior European politicians say on the record that an independent Scotland's accession to the European Union would be one of the quickest processes. They would make sure that process went as quickly as possible. There's a phrase that's sometimes used by people here that we would start at the back of the queue. There is no queue to join the European Union. Countries join at their own pace. Some countries race through it. Other countries have been going through it for years and have no prospect of getting any further. Turkey would be an obvious example of that. Ukraine more recently. But for us, at the moment, we are broadly aligned with the acquis. We're broadly aligned with European law. We've not been out of the EU for that long. Fundamentally, though, the European Union is an expansionist project. It's stronger the bigger it is, and Scotland would make for a very, very attractive EU member state. We have very large territorial waters. That is geostrategically important. It's also important for industries like fishing. It sends a very strong political message. The UK left the European Union. That was a blow to the unity of the project. Having a part of the UK then leave the UK and rejoin the EU would be massively symbolically important. A lot of European politicians have conveyed that to us. So I think if we end up in the situation where we are able to secure our independence through a legal democratic route here, that the process of rejoining the EU would be a pretty smooth and simple one for us. There's a question of what opt-outs we would negotiate. Would we want to be part of the common security and defence policy would be a debate we need to have. Things like the euro. We wouldn't be eligible to be in the Schengen zone because we would stay in the common travel area with the UK and Ireland because of the Good Friday Agreement, but it would still, I think, overwhelmingly be a very smooth accession process, and we now, for the first time in probably a few hundred years, have very strong allies of Scotland in every single European capital. Every EU member state's parliament and most of their governments have very strong allies of Scotland within them. That is a world away from where we were in 2014, where the best that the independence movement here could hope for was that other European politicians just stayed out of our debate because they weren't going to say something positive if they were invited to.
Just to maybe backtrack you a little bit there, you talked about the SNP, and both the Green Party and the SNP are working towards independence. As co-leader of the Greens, how do you approach working with the SNP, especially given maybe lessons learned from the Group House Agreement?
Yeah, so for anyone who wasn't aware, maybe if you were in Scotland at the time, the Green Party were in government in Scotland for the first time ever from 2021 to last year. That, you will notice, is not the full length of a parliamentary term. We entered into what was known as the Glasgow House Agreement in 2021. It's supposed to last until the election next May, and Hamza Yousaf ended it last year. It cost him his job. He collapsed his governing majority and then was surprised that he no longer had a governing majority and had to resign. That was his mistake though, and he owned it. He apologised. He recognised after the fact that he'd made a significant mistake. Ultimately, that was a difficult experience. Hamza's my friend, still is my friend. I still have a huge amount of respect for him. Unfortunately, he created a situation where someone had to lose. His plan was for the Greens to lose because he needed to look strong within his own party. The SNP was going through a huge amount of internal turmoil at that point. He didn't have authority within the party. He needed to do something that made him look like a strong leader and to regain control of the party. And really to regain the respect, or gain for the first time, the respect of people on the right of the SNP, those who were most opposed to the coalition with the Greens. That obviously didn't work out for him. That was a shame. He created a situation, somebody had to lose, and ultimately it was within our gift to decide who lost. And it's not my job to do damage to my party to save Hamza Yusuf's job. So he ended a confidence and supply agreement with us, therefore we no longer had confidence in him. He couldn't command a majority in Parliament, he had to resign at that point. The 3 years that we were in government together though, did prove that we were capable of that. So our parties have significant differences in values. For a start, in our constitution it makes clear the Scottish Greens are an anti-capitalist party, we're an eco-socialist party. The SNP are certainly not anti-capitalists. They very much are a capitalist party. They are a centrist party. They would say they're centre-left social democrats. I would say they're more centrist and kind of traditionally liberal, but in that broad space. We were able to cooperate though. So I was our negotiator. I was the Greens lead negotiator for the coalition agreement, or the cooperation agreement as we called it, and then I was our kind of co-owner of it, myself and the then Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, now the First Minister. We kind of co-managed that. Everybody else had a specific role. John and I had to kind of cross the piece, make sure nobody's falling out, keep the show on the road kind of role. And I think we achieved a huge amount. I think our government was a very, very productive one. Scotland will now have rent controls for the first time in about 40 years because of our government. We delivered free bus travel for young people, we delivered an emergency rent freeze and evictions ban at the height of the pandemic, set the first nature restoration fund. I could go through a long list of things that we achieved together. The conventional wisdom when Hamza collapsed the agreement was that we would all kind of never speak to each other again. But the reality is, we were more, and we are more mature than that. So that was a difficult episode, but that's politics. We got over it. Even since then, my party's back in opposition. We can still negotiate with the SNP on an issue-by-issue basis, because ultimately our job is to make Scotland look more like the vision that we have for it. So if I can negotiate with them to make a governing bill a little bit more green, or to make the budget have less money in it for the stuff I don't like and more money for the stuff that I do, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we've been able to do that. So since we left the government, we still negotiated a budget agreement with them. As a result of that, we made a whole range of changes to it. One of them was, when the schools started again this August, there were about 6,000 to 8,000 kids, I can't remember the final number, but about 6,000 to 8,000 children who had not been getting free school meals when school stopped in June, but started getting them in the August, because the Greens negotiated that into the budget. That's the kind of stuff that we're there to do. So even if there were still lingering issues of trust, which I generally don't think there are, even if there were still lingering issues of trust, I'm not willing to, my party's not willing to put our personal relationships, or lack thereof, with the SNP ahead of the opportunity to actually get stuff done for the people that we represent. That first budget after we left the government, it was a little bit difficult, because part of it was about a trust building exercise. We needed to be confident that what we agreed with them would actually then be delivered. When you're in government, you can make sure that your stuff gets delivered. When you're in opposition, you kind of need to rely on the good faith of the government. Counterweight to that is, as we proved with what happened with Hamza, worst case scenario, if the SNP breaches our trust so significantly, they don't have a majority in Parliament. If we were to vote with all the other opposition parties, that would be a majority. And we could do substantial damage to their agenda. I don't want to do that. My party and the SNP doesn't overlap a huge amount on a range of issues, but they are the closest to us, so I'm not interested in holding Scotland back from being marginally more progressive, which I think is generally the direction that they take it in. But ultimately that's the kind of the underlying understanding of our negotiations, whether it's on the budget or individual bills now, is if there's not some give and take, if they can't compromise with us enough to get us on board to vote for something, and we go ahead and vote with the opposition, we can bring their budgets down, they will lose votes of no confidence. Not the situation we want to get into, but that's the nature of parliamentary democracy with a minority government. So our default position is try and be constructive, try and work with them, try and achieve something, because opposition is dead easy, right? My life in a lot of ways is easier now than it was for the 3 years we were in government. But being able to put out a really witty press release about how shit the government are doesn't feed any children, doesn't save any species, doesn't create any jobs. My job is to do all of those things. So even though I'm not going to get as much of that done as I would want, obviously, because it's not a majority Green government, my job is to still get as much good out of the current Scottish Government as I can. If that is absolutely impossible, we can take that oppositional stance. But our default position is, even with what happened when the government collapsed, to still try and be constructive with the SNP. And to be honest, on a personal level, a lot of the relationships are still positive. Like, we are all still part of the independence movement together. There are plenty of personal friendships across the two parties. So we are generally pretty mature about it. I'll just finish on this, because I realise I've been talking for a long time on this one. This is like group therapy for me. I'm still getting over what happened in the government. Sometimes we thought our government was a bit tricky and there was a bit of tension underlying it. And then some of the original documents from the Labour-Liberal coalition from the first Scottish government started to get unsealed. So there's a government rule after a couple of decades, all your cabinet papers and stuff like that just get published. And at that point we started to realise, we thought our relationship was a little bit tense. Those guys fucking hated each other. We hadn't realised how much our predecessors absolutely hated each other. If they had been in government in the era of Twitter, you'd be watching basically a live stream of Scottish Government cabinet meetings if you just followed the Daily Record political editor's Twitter account. They were leaking everything about each other. So actually looking back on it, I think our government, for all the headlines about it, was one that functioned really broadly pretty well. Like, it was very rare that the parties were leaking or briefing against each other. And if nothing else, with the way it ended, the fact that we weren't at each other's throats for 3 years means that we can kind of just get on with doing the job, but instead of sitting on the same side of the table now, we sit on opposite sides.
Maybe jumping back a little bit there into more about party leadership, Zach Polanski in England has certainly made waves. And what do you think this approach could be replicated in Scotland, or should it be replicated in Scotland?
Yeah, so I saw an interview that Zach did a couple of days ago where he was asked on Sky News, is he the British or the English Zoran Mamdani, the now mayor-elect of New York? To which he said, I wish I was as cool as Zoran Mamdani. I wish I was as cool as Zach Polanski. I think I'm a few steps further down. So Zach's a good friend of mine. We were friends before either of us became leaders. We've both been involved in our parties for a while. But I think we ran our leadership campaigns at pretty much the same time and on pretty much the same platform. And our platform broadly was that people across the UK are really quite angry right now, and people have every right to be angry. It's far too hard to get by, it's far too expensive, there's just a general sense that things aren't working. Public services aren't working, the opportunity to get on in your life is so limited, so many people are trapped in private rented accommodation with no hope of saving enough for a deposit to get your own home, etc, etc, etc. And our argument is a pretty simple one. You are right to be angry, but it wasn't immigrants that put your rent up, it wasn't asylum seekers that made the weekly shop more expensive. It certainly wasn't trans people that made your life any more difficult. Those are the kind of easy answers, but ultimately really destructive lies that are being sold to a lot of people by the other end of the political spectrum by reform. My problem with a lot of the other mainstream parties is they're trying to just dismiss the public's anger. What we're trying to do across the UK's Green parties is say, no, you have every right to be angry. This is one of the richest countries in the history of the world, and yet thousands and thousands and thousands of children will have gone to school hungry this morning because of poverty. That is the result of political choices. That is all completely avoidable. So what we're trying to do basically is position ourselves in what Zach would describe as an eco-populist space. I'm relaxed about that description. I would say eco-socialist space, that's a phrase he uses as well. But ultimately, it's about, for us, trying to join the dots. So we recognise that it's not 2019 anymore. 2019 was really the high watermark of climate politics. So that was the point where Greta and the school strikes were at their peak. There was a huge amount of political interest in the climate as an issue in and of itself. It was a record year for Green parties in elections across Europe, and in fact I think across the world. We're not in 2019 anymore. We've had a pandemic and a cost of living crisis since then. And what we're doing is trying to join the dots and connect these issues together. So in Scotland, one of the ways in which we are failing to tackle the climate crisis is in transport emissions. So transport emissions go up and up and up. We've done really well at decarbonising lots of other areas, but the primary reason that we're failing in terms of our climate targets as a nation is because private car use keeps going up. That is also related to the cost of living crisis. So we are campaigning for the expansion of free public transport. The Greens delivered free bus travel for young people. We want to take it further than that. We abolished peak fares on ScotRail. We want to take it further than that. And for us, it is about recognising, like I was saying right at the start, the connection between the economic, the social, and the environmental crises. And in a lot of cases, what we're talking about is that the root cause of these things is greed. The reason that so many people are using their car rather than taking the bus is because buses are incredibly expensive and unreliable. That's because we have a privatised bus network that's run primarily in the interest of the owners of these bus companies, not in the interest of the public. So the way we solve both of those problems, the way that we reduce emissions by getting people to use public transport and help people save money, is by A, bringing our buses back into public ownership in that specific example, but just making public transport more affordable in the first place. Because there's a huge inequality there. On the one hand, you've got loads of people who are basically forced to use a car because public transport isn't available to them. In this city, just coming up on half of households don't have access to a car. So you've got lots of people who are forced to use a car because of the lack of availability or affordability. You've got a lot of other people who cannot even afford the car in the first place. They're just isolated. You've just got people who can really struggle to get around, so it makes it much harder for them to get a job or to get the uni or college course that they wanted, or just to go out and live their life. So again, that's proving that point. The economic, the social, and the environmental crises are all caused by the same root thing. And in a lot of these cases, it's not what we put on the front of the leaflet, but what we're talking about is neoliberalism. That's the root cause of a lot of this stuff. You have 40 years of disastrous deregulation, privatisation has left the state totally hollowed out and unable to meet the demands of our time. And the main two demands of our time right now are cost of living and the climate emergency. So for us as Greens, it's about saying, look, we're going to fix that, and we're honest about the fact that fixing that is going to be really expensive. The good thing is, this is one of the richest countries in the history of the planet, and we're going to make the people at the very top start paying their fair share so that we can fix these problems. In Scotland alone, the top 2% have more wealth than half of the population combined. We are more than capable of redistributing that. And if we do that, we can fund the kind of transformative policies that will solve all these various crises that people face. I realise I digressed more and more from the question you were originally asking. We are, in a lot of ways, in Scotland, I think we're certainly not getting the same amount of media coverage that Zach is getting. That is partly because he is an incredibly impressive performer. It's also because so much of our media is in London, and Zach is in London. Most people in Scotland consume UK-wide media, so their Scottish media exists. I was at the BBC today, but most people in Scotland will watch the UK-wide news at 6, news at 10. So in a lot of ways, they are more likely to see Zach than to see myself or my co-leader Gillian. I'm absolutely fine with that because Zach is a really impressive performer. But what we're seeing is the same kind of uptick. So our membership is growing at the moment. It's the highest it's been for a long time. It's probably going to hit its highest point ever very soon. We've had polls in Scotland recently that have been pretty similar to the UK-wide polls. So we got 8% in the last election. I think the last poll had us on 16.5%. That was ahead of or tied with Labour. So we're certainly on the up. I think it looks like the English Party's doing a lot better than us, and I'm delighted for how well they're doing. But I have become the co-leader of my party at a time where our membership is surging, our polling is surging, and we have a track record of really substantial wins, things that we've done that have improved people's lives that we'll be able to take into the election next May. So Zach is quite rightly generating a huge amount of excitement right now. I'm pretty convinced that we will be able to deliver a similarly impressive result in Scotland next May as what he's going to deliver in a lot of the English and Welsh elections.
You talked a bit there about the ongoing cost of living crisis. To narrow into one aspect in particular, how do the Scottish Greens plan to address the ongoing housing crisis, and what is your party's position on extending and strengthening rent controls in Scotland?
Yeah, so as I was saying, the reason that Scotland's Parliament has just passed a rent control bill is because of the Greens. That was our kind of centrepiece policy in the cooperation agreement with the SNP. It was a Green Minister, Patrick Harvey, my predecessor's co-leader, who introduced that bill to Parliament. He introduced the bill to Parliament, and then about 3 weeks later we were thrown out of the government. But to be fair to the SNP, they didn't drop that bill. They dropped a bunch of other stuff that we were doing, but they didn't drop the rent control bill. They did weaken it, so our original rent controls in the bill, the proposals we had, were stronger than what Parliament has just passed. So our original proposal was that you would be able to control rent so that it didn't rise above inflation. So a proper, a real terms rent freeze, effectively. Unfortunately, the SNP amended the bill to allow for rent increases slightly above inflation. We oppose that. My issue with that is that, okay, in any given year, 1% above inflation, maybe a little bit tough, but it's unlikely to cause a crisis. But year on year, cumulatively, that's going to really start to add up, that you've effectively locked in above inflation rent increases. So not perfect, but it is still really, really significant that Scotland is going to have rent controls back for the first time since Thatcher got rid of them in the 80s. In the first instance, because it will help people stay in their homes. But what's really significant about it is it's a really rare example of where power is redistributed in society. Landlords have a huge amount of power in Scottish society, and we would argue that renters don't have nearly enough. That bill actually redistributes some of that power. So it's not just a rent control bill. We included other measures in it, like the right to decorate your own home if you're a renter, the right to keep pets, things that landlords would be like petty dictators about and just say no for the sake of saying no. We're trying to rebalance that and say, for the landlord, this property is just an asset. For the renter, it is their home. And we come under a lot of attack from people saying, "Oh, but you're gonna drive landlords out of the sector." Okay, but they're not going to take the houses with them. If a landlord wants to stop being a landlord, they will probably sell that property, and then someone who wants to live in that property will buy it. That sounds like a reasonable solution to me. So we have delivered rent controls. They're not quite as strong as what we would have wanted. So if we have the opportunity, we'll take out that above inflation increase to it. We've included new protections from eviction, the new rights like keeping pets, decorating. We missed a bit of punctuation in a tweet about that once and made it sound like we'd given people the right to decorate their pet if they were a renter. I suppose you have that right as well. So there's a lot of good stuff in that bill. There are other measures that we need to take as well though. So Scotland at the moment has about 15,000 children who are homeless, so about 10,000 kids who are in temporary accommodation and 5,000 kids who are homeless in other ways. We have about 46,000 empty properties and about 22,000 second or holiday homes. So our homelessness problem is one that can be solved. I'm not saying it is as simple as saying every holiday home could simply become someone's permanent home. So there will be some that can. But the number of second homes and empty properties that we've got is way in excess of the number of homeless children, homeless families. So one thing that I did was, so Patrick Harvey, my predecessor, gave councils the power to double council tax on second homes and empty properties. Yes, it raises money for council services in the short term, that's a good thing. What we were really trying to do is persuade the owners of them to sell up. He doubled it because the law, as it was then, wouldn't allow him to go any further. I amended the housing bill to take that 200% cap away. So if Highland Council, for example, where there are a lot of holiday homes, wants to charge 300%, which is the rate in Wales, or 400% or 500%, they're allowed to do that. They would not be doing it because they realistically expect it to raise a lot of money. They would be doing it because if you suddenly get charged 500% council tax for a home that you only spend a couple of weeks in a year, even if you're pretty wealthy, you're probably going to sell up and that home will become available. In our first year of doing it, the first year of doubling council tax on these homes, we reduced the number of second homes in Scotland by 2,500. So it worked. That was our policy objective, was to reduce the number of second homes, because by reducing the number of second homes, you're increasing the number of properties that are available for people to actually live in. These people did not demolish their second homes just to spite me and Patrick. These properties went onto the market. If you live in an area, an island like Arran that I represent, take a community on Arran like Lomlash or Lochranza, coming up on half of all the homes in that community are now holiday homes or Airbnbs, short-term lets. Like every second property. There's some places in Fife that is similar. There's communities in the Highlands and Wester Ross where it is more than half. So we've totally hollowed out these communities. In Edinburgh, it's not really second homes, but in the city centre of Edinburgh and increasingly in Glasgow, it's Airbnbs, short-term lets. So there's way more that we need to do to regulate that. We try and use the tax system to do it. There's also licensing that we can do, because our argument is, yes, we need to build more homes to tackle the housing crisis. There is no point in us spending hundreds of millions or indeed billions of pounds building more homes if they just end up getting bought up by people who are going to use them as holiday homes. That's not going to solve the crisis. But if we, right now, were to build loads more homes on Arran, the people who could afford to buy them would be second-hand holiday home owners. That doesn't solve any problem. We need to create a situation where we've made the properties available and made it not worth the while of the wealthy to just buy them as additional properties. And sorry, I talked for far too long again. You're talking about expanding rent controls. So I presume that's kind of getting at the fact that student halls, student accommodation is not in it. That is something that we really wanted to do that with the original rent control bill. To cut a long story short, the issue with that is a student contract, so like a contract for if you live in Morano or Wilson Hall or whatever here, it's not just a tenancy agreement, it's a contract that provides you with wider services. So on a legal level, it would have been a totally different system. We did look at, could we just include purpose-built student accommodation in these rent control measures? It wouldn't have worked because legally it's a totally different thing. We did try and create a separate system of rent controls for PBSAs. The Greens moved amendments to the bill to do that. Every other party voted against that. Unfortunately, they voted to take that stuff out of the bill. So we will keep pushing for that. I have an idea for an alternative way that we can do it, that I am speaking to the government about, but it is something that we need to continue pushing at, because for us it feels like an unfinished mission. We were able to deliver rent controls for the private sector, and they'll be instituted soon, they've been passed by Parliament. PBSAs are not part of that, and we know that PBSA costs are ridiculous, and these companies are making huge amounts of money out of you over that. So that for us is unfinished business and something that we definitely want to come back to. Critically though, we need other parties to agree with us on that. That was one of those issues where we lost the vote like 120 to 7, which sometimes feels kind of heroic that you're fighting a good fight, but didn't help anybody that we lost 120 to 7. We need to get to the point in the next session where the next time we table that, there is a majority for it. Other parties, either through the goodness of their own hearts or because students have put so much political pressure on them, that other parties are willing to work with us to actually deliver that for PBSAs as well.
Just jumping into some of the audience Q&As just now, we've got one about the online safety bill. Do you feel that this is an overreach of government power, and has it maybe gone beyond its original remit of protecting children online?
Yeah, I mean, I think the online safety bill to me is a reflection of a core problem in the UK government. In some ways you can apply it to the Scottish government as well, of not wanting to take on corporate power. If the objective is to protect children online, the first thing you should be doing is regulating social media companies and actually making sure that there are really harsh penalties for them if, for example, they are allowing content about suicidal ideation to stay up there, as every major social media platform has done. There should be massively substantial penalties for them to do stuff like that. Unfortunately, the UK government doesn't really want to take on these companies, and for all I disagree with that and wish they did, I can to some extent understand why. I mean, if you take the example of like Elon Musk and Twitter, like his willingness to spend obscene amounts of money, his willingness to manipulate his own platform for political ends, makes him profoundly dangerous to democratic systems full stop. But if you're on the other side from him, I don't think the UK government is particularly confident that it would win a fight with Elon Musk right now. I think that is really sad and really worrying. I think they should do it. There would be public support for them, but I don't think they believe that they'd win that. I mean, the core issue of the Online Safety Act is that it doesn't work. Like, if you're trying to ban people from accessing certain kinds of content in this country, you've just fundamentally misunderstood how the internet works. It's like there was a Labour MSP a couple of years ago who proposed having a 9 PM watershed on the internet. And I don't think there's even any point in trying to explain how that's not how the internet works. I think the Online Safety Act kind of comes from that same place. I mean, the reality is the tangible effect, the tangible impact of the Online Safety Act is that tens, hundreds of thousands more people in the UK now use a VPN. So it's not solved anything. People still have the ability to access the kind of content that the Online Safety Act was supposed to prevent them accessing, or forcing them to provide ID before they can access adult content, etc. It doesn't do that. People are just going to use a VPN to do it instead. There are massive civil liberties issues with creating a system that forces people to provide their photographic ID to, for example, porn websites. And there are massive risks with a government basically creating a system where you are forced to give over your ID to some of the least reliable, least trustworthy people on the internet. But in general, people are not doing that. They're just getting a VPN and using that instead. So the Online Safety Act fails on its own test. It fails to do what it set out to do. And it is just rooted in the fact that the UK government does not want to take on corporate power. And I think that is sad. It's also pretty chilling for our democracy that you've got governments who are afraid to take on certain companies because they're not confident they win.
Thank you. And what are your thoughts about Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana's recent creation of a new party? Do you think this is beneficial to the Greens and the left in the UK, or are they only fragmenting the left further?
I wouldn't use the argument of, I'd be very careful about accusing another party of splitting the vote, because I've been in my party for long enough to remember when that argument was used against us. Sometimes it is still used against us. You know, some people in the SNP argue the Greens shouldn't stand because it splits the pro-independence vote. Sometimes you'll still get people in Labour who would say we shouldn't stand because it splits the left-wing vote. I don't know how many Labour Party members can in good conscience argue that they're still on the left, but there you go. So that's not the issue I have with it. I should say that I've met Jeremy before. I really, really like him. I've only done an online event with Zara, but I was really impressed. I thought she was really cool. And you know, anyone who is trying to build a more socialist society, anyone who is trying to take on the forces of capitalism, is a friend of mine. And I think they both have values that are very similar to mine and very similar to the Greens' values. I do have lots of issues with this project that they're creating, though. So they are 2 of the 6 MPs involved in creating this. Of the other 4, you've got landlords who object to the attempt to remove tax breaks from private schools, so they're in favour of tax breaks for private schools, who have made comments that I would certainly regard as being very transphobic, who seem to oppose LGBT rights in a wider sense, who oppose women's right to an abortion, for example. That to me is not a group of people who are going to create a genuinely socialist party. And part of my worry here is there's a lot of talk about how we need a broad left, we shouldn't be excluding anyone. My issue with that is by including people whose views are fundamentally opposed to what I would consider to be the basic rights and dignity of vulnerable groups in our society, you are in practice excluding people from those vulnerable groups. So what does it say to trans people, for example, that you're saying, oh no, our party, it will be in favour of trans rights, it's not got any policies yet, but it will be in favour of trans rights, but possibly a majority of the MPs setting the party up are actually opposed to that. I think there's something, it's quite hard for them to square there. That being said, I know really good people who are involved in trying to set that up. I understand entirely why they're trying to do it, and I'm perfectly willing to wait and see what they do. You know, we're talking about a party that doesn't have a name yet, doesn't have any policies yet, so it feels unfair of me to kind of judge them now and say, no, these people are not part of the same movement, they're not my fellow travellers. I do want to wait and see what they become. That being said, I think if you are someone who wants to build a more social society in this country, if you want to be part of a genuinely effective political vehicle to do that, that party already exists. That eco-socialist party already exists. It is the Greens. We have elected parliamentarians in the Scottish Parliament, in the UK Parliament. We have hundreds and hundreds of councillors across the UK, and we have these established party organisations. The Scottish Greens, we're coming up on, I'll keep refreshing my phone tonight because we're about 3 people away from being a party of 9,000 members. The Green Party of England and Wales has 150,000 members. That's more than the Tories. There's a lot more than the Tories these days, actually. So if you want to just get involved in a party that is already doing that stuff, rather than expending your political energy on what is a really draining and difficult process of setting up a political party, establishing its rules, its constitution, its standing orders, if you just want to get on with trying to change the world around us, recognising that the crises that we face are so urgent that they require us to fight and deliver that change now, the Greens exist, and we are there for socialists who share our values. And yeah, I say socialists who share our values because if you say, I'm a socialist, but I oppose women's right to bodily autonomy, I oppose abortion rights, but I oppose LGBT rights, you're not my fellow traveller. Like, that is a foundational value of the Greens, that we believe in equality, that includes women's equality, that includes LGBT equality. But if you share our values, then you can join our movement right now and just get wired straight into delivering this kind of change. We have a track record of delivering it. I mentioned that we've delivered free bus travel for young people, scrapped ScotRail peak fares, that kind of stuff. We have also repeatedly taxed the rich to pay for this stuff. That's why I mentioned that we've increased tax on holiday homeowners. The Greens rewrote the income tax system in Scotland, so higher earners here pay more, those on the lowest incomes pay a little bit less than they would in the rest of the UK. So we have done a huge amount of redistribution of wealth and of power, and I think if you're the kind of person who agrees with that's socialist politics. If you want to get involved in a movement to deliver that, then you've got Green parties in the UK right now that are riding high, membership is surging, we're polling equal with Labour, highest ever polling that we've been at, we're on track for really exciting results next year, and if you get involved, you can help us deliver that kind of change. So I say that with all due respect to the people who are trying to set up this new party. If they genuinely believe their values are different to ours and they want to set up something that is different to us, then fair enough. But if you're someone who looks at the Greens and think, that's a solid left-wing party delivering genuinely progressive, genuinely socialist change, just join us and help us do it rather than spend the next year fighting over what the standing orders and the name of your new organisation is going to be.
Talking a little bit more about the Green Party's values, we've got a question here from the audience. What is the Green Party's stance on the ruling pushed by the For Women group, and what would you do to combat it and protect the rights of trans people in Scotland?
So Greens this is kind of relevant to the discussion we were just having around Jeremy Corbyn's party. For us, trans rights are human rights. We are absolutely gutted, like genuinely, profoundly upset at the Supreme Court ruling around the meaning of sex and the Equality Act. I just find it absolutely inconceivable that when MPs were working on the Equality Act in 2009, 2010, when civil servants were drafting it, that what they intended was essentially a bathroom ban for trans people. The idea that that's what they intended from that to be is farcical. And indeed, one of the senior civil servants, one of the people who wrote the Equality Act, has repeatedly said since this Supreme Court ruling, that is absolutely not what we intended, that is not what we meant by that. I respect the Supreme Court's right to make this ruling. I profoundly disagree with it. In a democracy, you are able to profoundly disagree with court rulings. That is the law. I recognise the Supreme Court's authority on that. But at the moment, I'm getting phone calls and emails from parents of trans children who are afraid to send their children to school. I have trans friends who have been working from home for months because they don't know if they would be allowed to go to the toilet if they went to the office. I have trans friends who are no longer going to the gym, they're no longer taking part in sports activities. We have created a situation where for so many trans people, their life has been dramatically shrunk to the point where it feels like more of a risk than it has ever been just to leave their front door. One of the most ridiculous examples of this was an email I got recently from the parents of a trans child who told me that the egg and spoon race at their kids' school was considered competitive sport. So their trans child was not allowed to compete with the other kids of the same gender, which I just found horrendously upsetting, but also fundamentally absurd that a primary school egg and spoon race would be considered competitive sport. Who cares who wins an egg and spoon race amongst 10-year-olds? Come on. But the core point is this is about robbing the dignity of trans people. So for us, we would certainly want the Equality Act to be rewritten, to clarify here. We as Greens believe that gender should be on the basis of self-ID, as is the case in dozens of other countries. Ireland has had gender self-ID since 2015 for a decade. The sky didn't fall in. It was, I think, probably the single most horrible experience that I've had, and I'm a privileged cisgender person, the most horrible experience that I've had in my almost a decade of being an MSP was us passing the Gender Recognition Reform Act through Parliament, which was where we were moving to a system of self-ID. Not perfect, but a system of self-ID for trans people to be able to obtain gender recognition certificates and be recognised as who they are. A gender recognition certificate ultimately has really only a couple of uses. You can get married as who you really are, you can die as who you really are, and some stuff to do with pensions and things like that. The Gender Recognition Reform Bill that we passed in Parliament and was then vetoed by the UK government was not about bathrooms or changing rooms or anything like that, but the whole debate became about that. In fact, very often the debate became about prisons specifically. It became a debate around stuff that wasn't even in that bill, and it was because a small number of people in our society are absolutely desperate to make it impossible for trans people to go about living their life, like just impossible. Some of these people do want to drive trans people out of society completely, and for a lot of them, it is because they are the same people who opposed every step along the way of equality for LGBT people as well, and they've never got over the fact that they lost on all that. These are people who never reconciled themselves with equal marriage, with civil partnerships, with equal right of adoption, etc. They want to wind the clock back, and it sounds, for a lot of people, unbelievable that we could actually wind the clock back on this stuff. But we don't need to look far. Like I believe today in the US Supreme Court, they're hearing arguments that would potentially reverse their ruling on equal marriage. When Trump got in, one of the first things that his administration did was remove all the content about trans people from the Stonewall National Memorial. Then they waited a couple of months and then they removed all the stuff about bisexual people as well. This attempt to drive a wedge between trans people and the rest of the LGBTQ community is, to me, incredibly sinister and incredibly dangerous, and I'm glad that the overwhelming majority of our community have completely rejected that, because fundamentally what we're talking about here is just people's ability to go about living their lives. And the ruling has created, I think, some absurd and unworkable situations. We're constantly told this Supreme Court ruling has brought clarity. It's given us clarity on what sex means. It's given us clarity on what to do in all of these situations. It's not really. I mean, there's an example I use that I'm sometimes a bit loath to use it. It's about a trans friend of mine, but he uses it himself a lot, and he wants me to use it as an example. He is a tall, well-built, bald man with a beard. And as of that ruling, he is now supposed to use the women's toilet, because that's his biological sex, that's his legal sex, according to the Supreme Court ruling on the Equality Act. And he makes the point, is that actually going to make any women in that toilet feel safer? That that's the toilet he has to use. If the argument here was to stop quote-unquote men from using women's toilet, this ruling has resulted in men using women's toilets. He, as a trans man, is now legally obliged to use women's toilets. It doesn't make him feel any better, it makes him feel humiliated, but he's well aware that he makes women feel unsafe because he is a very tall man. So it creates these absurd situations. It's not working for anyone. And it's not just trans people that are being hurt by this. We've already seen loads of examples of people who just don't, like cisgender people who don't conform to stereotypes about their gender, particularly quite butch lesbians who are being challenged in toilets, challenged in changing rooms. There was an example recently of a woman who was thrown out of a toilet in, I think, a Marks and Spencer's, because she didn't look like the stereotype of a woman. She was a cisgender woman. The Equality Act, as in that Supreme Court ruling, would absolutely recognise her. I hate this phrase, but she's biologically a woman. But what we have created is this atmosphere where anyone who doesn't look like they conform to their gender can be challenged on that. And to me, that is a colossal step backwards, not just for trans people, but for the whole of our society. That is a horrible, corrosive, deeply conservative step backwards. And if the Greens were given the opportunity, one of the first things that we would do is correct that, to clarify that that is not what the Equality Act intended. As the people who wrote the Equality Act have repeatedly made clear, it is not what they intended.
Thank you. To synthesize maybe a few questions from the audience just here, a few people have asked about the fact that Scotland, in particular Glasgow, faces problems dealing with drug abuse, substance abuse, and alcoholism. How do the Greens seek to tackle these issues in Scotland?
Yeah, so kind of starting principle for us would be that the war on drugs has failed. So treating illegal drug taking as a criminal activity has been a catastrophic failure. It has ruined so many people's lives, and it has clearly not worked because, as has been pointed out, we have an absolutely horrendous record when it comes to drug deaths. Now, There are other jurisdictions with the same laws around drugs as Scotland's, most obviously. Drug law is reserved to the rest of the UK. The Misuse of Drugs Act applies everywhere equally. Scotland has a higher record, a much, much worse record when it comes to drug deaths. So it's not just about the law, but our number one focus should be how do we prevent people from dying? What do we do to save people's lives? So we have looked at best practice elsewhere in the world, and that's why we opened the Thistle, a safe consumption facility in Glasgow. And that is about recognising the fact that people are going to take drugs. The war on drugs, this attempt to prevent the supply of drugs, people consuming illegal drugs that are currently illegal, has failed. We are much better off from a harm prevention, harm reduction point of view, trying to just make it as safe as possible for people. So the Thistle is somewhere you can go. If you are going to take drugs, if you're going to inject, you can do it in a relatively safe environment. There are medical professionals on standby, because the key thing here is what we're trying to do is prevent people from overdosing. That's where a lot of the excess drug deaths in Scotland come from. You can prevent an overdose if you have a medical professional on standby who can administer naloxone or something like that. We have seen elsewhere in the world that that is a way to save lives. Now that is a short-term intervention. What the Thistle also does is it provides people who are addicted to drugs with an opportunity to access services, to speak to someone about that. If you are shooting up in a back alley, that is a massive and immediate risk to your health. If you overdose there, no one else is there, you are going to die. And that is what's happened to far too many people. That's what's destroyed far too many families. If you do it in a facility like the Thistle, there are people on standby who will save your life. And that is the number one immediate objective. But there are also people there who can speak to you about getting the help that you need to support you to end that addiction. That is what is really important about it, creating that safe space where people who, for understandable reasons, do not want to go anywhere near authority, don't want to go near the state, are deeply scared, traumatized, suspicious people. You've provided them with a space where they can interact with this state. They can interact with people who will provide them with support, who will signpost them to other places they can go. That is key. Beyond that immediate, save your life in that moment, we are providing people with that pathway towards something safer. For us as well as Greens, we do want to legalise and regulate drugs. In some cases, it's about recognising the fact that there are drugs that are illegal but less harmful than legal ones. Cannabis is in lots and lots and lots of ways far less harmful than alcohol. But the alcohol industry did a great job decades ago to make sure that they stayed legal and largely unregulated, and that other drugs were prevented. I have a friend who is a retired GP now. When he started as a trainee doctor, we were still able to prescribe heroin to stable addicts because it was recognised that that would be a way to support them and to then get them on a path off of their addiction. We can't do that now for a combination of reasons. Some of it is about the power of the alcohol and tobacco industries wanting to make sure that there were no other legal ways to enjoy yourself with those kind of substances. They wanted to lock down that market. Some of it is a kind of moral puritanism, judging addiction as being a kind of individual moral failure, which is catastrophic and really, really harmful. So for us, moving towards a system where by legalising and regulating drugs, you're taking them out of the hands of criminals, you are making it far, far less dangerous. You're then massively reducing all the secondary harms that come from illegal drugs. So there's the danger from getting a bad batch of a drug, people overdosing, people dying, etc. But the fact that the drug trade is controlled by criminal gangs connects it with all sorts of other things that are massively damaging our society, that are causing immense amount of suffering here and across the world, particularly in countries like Colombia or Mexico, etc. If we took that out of the hands of criminal gangs, if we made it a legal and highly regulated trade, then you would make everything around it much, much, much safer. And surely that needs to be the number one objective, is saving people's lives. And this stuff isn't fanciful. This is basically what they've done in Portugal. And they have some of the lowest rates of drug-related deaths in the world because they have taken this approach. The comparison here, in terms of taking out the criminal justice system, is what we did with knife crime. So Glasgow, up until the 80s, had a reputation for being like the knife crime capital of the UK or of Western Europe. And yeah, there was a huge amount of violent crime in Glasgow. And treating it purely as a criminal justice issue was not working. We were just locking people into lifetimes of criminal activity, because once you get that on your criminal record, once you've been in jail, you're almost certainly going to be stuck in that one. You come out of jail, you're not going to be able to get a job, you can only hang around with other people with criminal records, you get sucked back into it, you commit another offence, you end up back in jail. That's a cycle that people go through throughout their whole lives. In Glasgow, we set up the Violence Reduction Unit a while ago, maybe about 20 years ago, that tried to treat violent gang-related activities, particularly knife crime, as fundamentally being a public health issue in the first instance. Not to make it not a crime to stab somebody, still a crime to stab somebody, but to make sure that we were providing people with help and support to exit that kind of lifestyle, to change their life, to get safer people around them, to remove them from the kind of networks that were pushing them into that. And that has been a massive success. We have massively reduced knife crime in Glasgow. We have made this city so much safer because we recognised that treating it as a public health issue was a much more effective way to stop people engaging in that kind of criminal behaviour, because you were supporting them out of it rather than condemning them to a life of constantly repeating it, broken up by periods where they were in prison. More people come out of prison with a drug addiction than go in, by the way. We were able to break that link. So I think if we look at what Portugal has done in terms of how they've reduced drug deaths, but also what we've done in Glasgow in terms of reducing knife-related crime and deaths from knife crime, it's pretty clear. Treat this as a public health issue, focus on things that will save people's lives rather than judging them and then condemning them and then criminalising them.
I think to wrap up with one final question then, you serve on the cross-party group on Palestine. In your opinion, what role can and should Scotland play in addressing the ongoing genocide?
So I am incredibly proud that Scotland's Parliament is the first in the world, so far as we're aware, certainly so far as the Palestinian National Committee are aware, that voted in favour of joining the BDS movement, joining the global boycott, divestment and sanctions movement against Israel. That was a huge achievement. So that was a proposal put forward by the Greens, and the SNP supported it, so there was a majority in favour of it, and it passed. Symbolically, that is useful. For us, though, we didn't put that proposal forward so that our Parliament could make a symbolic gesture. Symbolic gestures don't stop genocides, they don't save lives. For us, that was a call to action. What really frustrates me is, for all I have a huge amount of respect for people in the SNP who have been out on the marches for Palestine with us, who have spoken passionately in favour of a genocide, who have condemned what Israel has done, as a government, their actions are still not matching their words on this. And the most obvious comparison is what the Scottish Government did when Russia invaded Ukraine, the full-scale invasion in 2022. So within, I think, a week of Russia invading Ukraine, the Scottish Government issued an open letter, a call to every business in this country that said, stop trading with Russia, break all your links with Russia. We need to stand with Ukraine. This is a matter of the defence of democracy. This is standing in solidarity with the people who are at threat of complete destruction. You must stop all trade with Russia, because that's how we can play our part in putting pressure on them to stop the war. We are now a couple of years into Israel's live-streamed genocide of Palestine, and the Scottish Government still refuses to issue an equivalent call for businesses to boycott Israel. I find that very, very frustrating. We have made some progress. So in February of this year, the Greens brought a debate to Parliament saying that the Scottish Government should stop giving public money, stop giving grants to Israel's arms dealers, and everybody voted against that. So another one of those 120 to 7 kind of votes. That was really disappointing in the middle of the genocide. By September, the SNP had changed their position. So right now, the Scottish Government has stopped giving money to Israel's arms dealers. So that's huge progress from where we were. It's the kind of thing that should have happened not as soon as this started after October 7th, 2023. It should never have been happening in the first place. Israel has been committing a genocide in Palestine since 1948. It has just massively escalated in the last couple of years. So there is still a huge amount for us to do. Our government has agreed to join the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, but has not said that Scottish businesses should boycott Israel, has not banned Israeli-owned companies from accessing public grants, just banned Israel's arms dealers. We put forward proposals, for example, that the 90 or so companies on the United Nations list of those who are complicit in the West Bank settlements that they should be banned from getting a public contract in Scotland or getting any grants, any public money. The Scottish Government still hasn't done that. So, yep, cutting off the arms dealers from getting any public cash, great, we finally made progress on that. Should have happened years ago, glad it's happened now. The government currently have a position that I just don't think can be reconciled, where in principle they support the boycott movement, but they've not taken any of the practical actions since then to make sure that Scotland's playing our part in that. We should be boycotting every Israeli-owned business in the same way that we did with apartheid South Africa. That's how you put economic pressure on them. We have tens of billions of pounds in our public pension funds in Scotland, and a huge amount of that is tied up in companies that are either Israeli-owned or that are complicit in the occupation. So multinationals, but ones that are complicit in the occupation. We have companies like construction companies who have contracts here in Scotland, who supply digger trucks here in Scotland, and who are also supplying it to the West Bank settlements, to the Israeli military for what they're doing in Gaza, etc. We can ban all of that. Not a public penny should be going to companies complicit in the genocide. The Scottish Government still hasn't done that. So, as much as we've made progress, there's still a huge amount for us to do. And I do not for a second accept the argument that these issues are reserved. It's for the UK government to deal with issues of foreign policy, and the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament should know their place. We all, every single one of us, have a collective responsibility to prevent genocide. And it really turns my stomach that I have spent close to a decade now, every single year, standing beside other politicians when it comes to Holocaust Memorial Day, and we talk about never forgetting and never again. And we talk about Cambodia and Srebrenica and Rwanda as these catastrophic failures, that we should have learned from what happened in the Holocaust and prevented what happened in those situations, but we didn't do it, and we need to try and prevent that now. I am now going to spend the next couple of years, I am quite sure, standing beside politicians who either cheered on a genocide or who ran obstruction for them and tried to obfuscate and use smoke and mirrors to distract people, or who at best said absolutely nothing. And they're going to stand up in the debates we have every year and say, never forget, never again. But they were tested. We were all tested. We've watched a genocide unfold in front of our eyes, and they let it happen. And in some cases, I would argue they proactively participated in it. So we need to do so much more to put pressure on Israel. The one specific that my party are pushing for at the moment, and that we've encouraged the Lord Advocate, the head of Scotland's justice system, to do, is to prosecute any Israeli soldier who is resident in Scotland. Because unfortunately, there were people from the UK who went out and volunteered and fought in the Israeli occupation forces, who've taken part in a genocide, who have broken the Genocide Convention, committed war crimes, and who've returned here to the UK. That is a crime under Scots law. We took the International Criminal Court statutes and we put them into our domestic law in 2001. So a war crime committed anywhere in the world by someone who's resident in Scotland is a war crime in Scotland. It's a crime under Scots law. So one thing that the Greens are very keen to see is for any identified soldier who took part in the occupation to be prosecuted under Scots law for the role they've played in the genocide. These people should not be allowed a single moment's rest for the rest of their lives. Like, we have spent the last couple of years hearing testimony of doctors who have spent all day, every day, doing emergency surgeries on children, 5, 6, 7-year-olds who have been deliberately shot in the head. So not they've been hit by shrapnel or caught in an airstrike, which is bad enough, but the deliberate and systematic execution of small children by Israeli soldiers, some of whom will, I have no doubt, return to the UK and be walking our streets right now. These people should never be allowed a moment's rest. We should be prosecuting them. The full force of the law should be used against them. And at the same time, we should be putting all economic pressure that we can on Israel to play our part in forcing an end to the occupation. This is an issue that I don't think any politician at any level, so not just at our level, but even at local council level, should absolve themselves of responsibility for. We all have a collective responsibility to prevent genocide. We have failed in that collective responsibility for the last 2 years, but it's not over yet. There's still so much that we can do now that is about making sure that perpetrators face justice for what they've done, but that the survivors in Palestine can also see justice as well. There's so much for us to do. And I'll finish on a positive. For all the criticisms I might have of Glasgow University management on some occasions, I am really, really proud of the support that this university has given to students from Gaza. There are a number of students from Gaza who have arrived here in the last couple of weeks and since the start of term in September, and the university has done an outstanding job of supporting them where the UK government has failed and refused to do. I think we can be really proud to live in a society, even if our governments fail us, I think we can be proud to live in a society where so many people are willing to step up and support our Palestinian friends. So finish on a positive there, because otherwise that was a horrendously negative and dispiriting experience.
I think, even though I said last question last time, I think just to round us off with one more thing and bring it back more to campus and maybe what many students in the audience are thinking about, is a major issue on campus just now is the divestment movement, which seeks to end the university's ties with Israel, arms industry, and fossil fuels. So I know while you said there that the university has made movements to help students from Palestine seek higher education here at the university. What words and advice would you give to students as they fight to end financial ties with the university in Israel?
Yeah, so that's what I was talking about, the criticisms I would have, but this would definitely be one of them. I mean, there's a real cognitive dissonance there for the university to have quite rightly taken the step of making sure that they are welcoming and supporting Palestinian students, but that they are still invested in the companies who are responsible for the genocide that's been inflicted on those Palestinians, on these students and their families. So part of it is just about making sure that that moral outrage continues, because this is outrageous. We are all collectively coming under a lot of pressure right now to just forget and move on. Oh, there's a ceasefire, move on. We came to an agreement, hostages were released, the bombing has stopped. Well, the bombing has not stopped, and only some of the hostages have been released. There are still thousands of Palestinian hostages in Israeli prisons. Israel is the only country in the world that systematically prosecutes children under a military court system, Palestinian children, not Israeli children. Even before October 7th, about 1 in 4 of those Palestinian children were forced to sign confessions in Hebrew, a language that they don't even speak. And there are still thousands and thousands of Palestinians who are trapped inside that system. So making sure that the pressure is still there. One thing I would say on this is the moral outrage needs to continue. That is the key reason why we are campaigning for things like divestment. It is also worth really zeroing in on the financial arguments around this. So pension fund managers have a fiduciary duty, which is basically a duty to make sure that they are getting best value for money out of the fund's investments, that they are securing a pension for the people whose pensions are subject to that fund. There is pretty overwhelming evidence that these are incredibly risky investments. So fossil fuels, risky investments because either there's going to be runaway climate change and the value of fossil fuel companies is going to drop through the floor, or we're going to tackle the climate crisis and the value of fossil fuel companies is going to drop through the floor. So the argument that we've used to get universities like Glasgow actually to divest from fossil fuels was partly about the moral reason that you need to take part in tackling this crisis. It was also about saying this is incredibly financially irresponsible to remain invested in this. I think the same applies when it comes to campaigning for divestment from Israel's arms dealers specifically, but any company that's complicit in the occupation, because it may take longer than we would want. It's certainly going to take longer than we would want. But these companies are, by being complicit in a genocide, are complicit in a crime under international law that can be prosecuted by the international courts. These companies can be held liable, both internationally but also within specific nations as well. So one of the things that we need to do, the kind of wider movement of solidarity with Palestine, is to make sure that there are maximum legal and financial implications for the complicit companies, because that puts pressure on them directly, but it will also put pressure on pension funds to divest, to withdraw from these companies. If a company is subjected to a very effective boycott, for example, and that hits the value of that company, it doesn't look like a very good investment opportunity anymore. The pension funds will withdraw. That will harm the company even more. Ideally, that will force them to end their complicity in the occupation. So keeping up the moral outrage is the most important thing, because this is outrageous. It's literally the worst crime that anyone could possibly be complicit in. But we also need to make clear the financial arguments. These are bad, these are risky investments, because quite rightly, people across the world want to see justice and want to see those who've been complicit in the occupation feel the full force of the law. You do not want your pension fund to be invested in a company that's potentially going to be dragged through the courts because of its complicity in a genocide. it is sad that we need to make financial arguments that people are not compelled enough by the fact that there is a genocide and these companies are complicit in it. Some people are not compelled by that though, but they will be compelled by the argument about the bottom line, about maintaining the value of the pensions. So zoning in on that as well, I think, is strategically a really important move for us as we move on to the next steps with these kind of campaigns.
Thank you guys for coming out, and thank you as well to my little committee who helped set up the room. But most importantly, thank you so much to Ross for spending your evening with us.